We're going to launch our first panel, and our first panelist is Melissa Nobles, Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at MIT, and professor and former department head of political science. She will lead the discussion with a description of actions taking place on this campus. So I'm going to turn things over to Melissa.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Paula. And good afternoon, everyone. As Richard's indicated, as we all know, the stakes are high in this discussion today. They are high because every dimension of human existence is affected by our natural environment and changes to it. So solving the climate crisis requires that we first face the climate crisis in all of its complexities. And in my view, the humanities, arts, and social sciences provides us with the important essential tools to do so. After all, we all recognize that a fundamental responsibility of a research institution is to expose us to the bodies of knowledge that prepare us to understand and address extremely complex problems. And if there is ever an issue that requires a combination of advanced technological and scientific capabilities, along with social scientific and humanistic knowledge, it is certainly climate change. So in my time this afternoon, and we don't have much time, I'd like to provide a sample of the research and teaching that is happening in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. This teaching and research is helping us to think more deeply, to think more creatively, and more broadly about climate change. And with that, I'm going to share my screen. So one of the most important and new of our efforts, it comes out of JPAL. So research shows us that climate change disproportionately and adversely affects people living in poverty, and that currently global efforts to address poverty are being threatened and undermined by climate change. Government leaders, both here in the United States and abroad, need more and better evidence about the efficacy of technological and policy innovations in order to develop solutions. So the climate initiative of JPAL, and you all recall the JPAL this year, last year actually, the two faculty founders, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, were winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics. So JPAL is well positioned to work along with leaders in government, NGOs, science, both natural scientists and social scientists, and also combining with the private sector to design, pilot, evaluate, and develop to scale technological and policy innovations in 4 areas: mitigating carbon emissions, reducing pollution, thinking about adaptation to climate change, and shifting towards cleaner forms of energy. In political science, of course, we're thinking about public opinion. And one of the alumna of our program, she has a PhD in political science, works in public opinion. In fact, she works on civic engagement and communication and policy dimensions of climate as a research associate in Yale's program on climate change communication. So she came here to study and in turn is now going out into the world and helping us think more deeply about how we talk about climate change. Her research and her work now begins with an observation that I think many of us could easily agree, and that is addressing climate change in this country and indeed abroad is as thorny an issue as technological challenges are, although in different ways. So we know the technology is thorny, but the politics are thorny, albeit perhaps differently. And she examines in her work how American elected leaders think about environmental policy, how the publics think about climate change and policy, and the interactions between the two in a way that the politicians attempt to be responsive to their publics, and the publics in turn impress upon their leaders what it is that they want. And those two, as many of us know, don't always align. So her research reminds us, and here I'm going to quote from her because I think it captures beautifully what certain of the challenges are. No matter how technically attractive a particular technology is, its viability ultimately depends on public acceptance. And that public acceptance in turn can depend on the technology's aesthetic, on the economics of the technology, obviously, on the characteristics of the technology itself, and on the social meanings of that technology within a particular local environment. Facing climate change in many ways, and certainly when I think about it for myself, I feel as if I need the tools of a moral philosopher. And as our philosophy and faculty inform us, anyone engaging with the issues of global issues of well-being, and most certainly climate change is among them, is in fact doing moral philosophy. So the ethics of climate change, which is a very popular class here, and for all the MIT students watching, I mean, here's my plug that you should take it, brings to us the moral philosopher's toolkit to a set of fundamental questions and problems. That is, what is the nature of the threat posed by climate change? And given the uncertainties, what should be done about it? Should individuals or governments take action? And is the current generation possible for acting on behalf of future citizens? So the class raises a number of challenging topics that, unlike problem sets, do not have quantifiable answers. One student who took the class reflected, if you're really interested in understanding why we should be doing something about climate change, this class prepares you to talk about the issue coherently with specialists, and as importantly, with insights. So we know that many of our students are deeply interested in doing something about climate and feel it to be a moral imperative. This class gives us the tools to think about it in a rich and deep way. So we would expect that philosophy would have something to say about this, but it doesn't end there. We also have the arts, which have an important role to play. So changing individual behavior, which is often something that we are all motivated to do to kind of push our concerns about climate change into our own personal actions. So changing individual behavior oftentimes requires emotional engagement, and it requires imagination. And theater arts provides both of those. And it provides a way to think about using those skills to think creatively and acting out our concerns about climate change. So one of our professors, Charlotte Braithwaite, recently collaborated on a project which had at its core the concerns about climate change. And so she put together a play in which climate change was exemplified by the loss of bee colonies. And she looked at that and said, it's not just the bees, but it's also connected to our degradation of human society. So, in theater, she says, we create the world as the world should be. So it allows us to think differently about the world in much the same ways that in STEM, we think about the impossible and we try to get there. Similarly, theater does the same. So as I said at the beginning, the point of this was just to provide a sample of the classes that we offer in SHAS. And these are only a sample. But throughout the school, from political science to economics to history to anthropology, all of these disciplines can be brought to bear and must be brought to bear if we are to take on the complexity of climate change. It is obviously a scientific and technological problem, but as importantly, it is a human one embedded in the human world. And the domains of knowledge here give us important tools to understand that. I'd like to just conclude with a final remark about how we think about research institutions in general. We obviously all see the need to bring multiple perspectives to bear on thinking about climate issues. But as I see it, the more that research institutions can invent practical ways for these varied forms of knowledge to intersect, blend, and become mutually informing, the more quickly we can generate effective climate solutions. So for the MIT students out there, I look forward to seeing you in more of our classes, and I look forward very much to the discussion afterwards. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Melissa. That was really an incredible show of all of the things that we have to offer, and one of the reasons why universities bring us together to address these issues. Our next panelist is John Deutch. He is an institute professor, a former provost, a former dean of science, and a former department head of chemistry. John's leadership positions in the government include several in the US Department of Energy, as well as his MIT roles. They provide him with a unique perspective on the role of universities in addressing climate change. So I'm going to turn things over to John.
Well, I'm very, very pleased to be here with everybody this afternoon, a very interested and large audience, which displays the fact that the MIT community, students, faculty, alumni, all are extremely concerned with the climate crisis and interested in knowing how our university can contribute to the solutions of those very challenging problems. I want to start with a broader perspective than our title suggests, the role of research universities at MIT's climate initiative. I want to start off by speaking about the role of US and universities generally, in general. That role is very clear and has been for hundreds of years and is true of all leading universities around the globe. Our purpose is education and scholarship. And through those central purposes is the way we inform our communities and the way we get to common action. When universities speak out, they speak out with a credibility for the community, and it is something which is important to know. And they are listened to in a special way because they focus on facts and they are concerned with the public interest. However, when universities begin to speak about policy matters, they must be very, very cautious. They cannot speak out with one voice, or they should do so very, very rarely, because there are different views, different interests, and different points of view within the university, but also, more importantly, in the broad community. When universities speak out, they should not think that they're speaking about the only issue. So today we're talking about climate change, but we also have the other pressing issues facing the globe of the pandemic, of health in general, of poverty, of race, all which deserve and command our attention. So, as Melissa so properly said, to understand how the community deals with the richness of these issues and the variety of them requires an attention to basic questions of history, philosophy, creative arts. They all impact the way we think about them. So I want to emphasize that it is my view that universities should be careful, cautious about speaking out with a single voice on any particular important social matter. I'm reminded that Jerry Wiesner, when he left being President Kennedy's science advisor and became president of MIT, he was the leader in the nation, possibly in the world, with respect to the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need to get rid of nuclear weapons and enter into broad, far-reaching arms control agreements. When he became president, he said, I am not going to speak or participate in these activities that are so important to me because I believe that an MIT president should not speak out or lead arms control efforts because they must remain focused on matters of scholarship and education. That's his point of view and the way he behaves. But it reminds us that universities have broad responsibilities, and when we select a particular area, it is effectively saying it's a priority area. And I'm not sure that everybody in the world would say that climate change is the single most important. Nuclear weapons are important, health is important, poverty is important, racial justice and democracy are important. My second point is that universities have limited resources available. And we always have to keep that. I very much dislike the fact that their limited resources mean that we have to make difficult choices. But those are indeed the realities. So when MIT begins to spend its resources on supporting climate activities, it's perfectly legitimate because it is a key global issue and it is of great interest to the community, faculty, students, and staff. But also it means that choices are being made. One of these choices we'll be talking about, I expect, a little bit more recently. But that is, how should MIT have a goal of reducing its own climate footprint? Many universities are addressing that question, but MIT has, through the incredibly strong leadership of Julie Newman, which we'll be hearing from more in a moment, and Julie Newman, is not only interested in reducing emissions, she's interested in having this university and society more generally deal with sustainability, a sustainable economy that can grow, but without having environmental damage. But what MIT has done with its very distinguished leadership of Joe Higgins and the MIT Facilities Group has taken on taken a position in the Summit Farms photovoltaics production area in North Carolina, and taken a piece of their power purchase agreement, and with that have increased the amount of carbon-free electricity that can be credited to MIT. So indeed, as time goes on, our goal is to reduce, I believe, by 32%, I may be off in that number, to reduce our carbon footprint between the year 2015 or 14 and 2020. Well, in point of fact, we are reducing our carbon footprint in the sense of a fraction. The percent of greenhouse gas emissions from our own campus activities is a smaller fraction of the total electricity that we are using, if we count the Summit contribution as being a carbon-free contribution to be credited in the account of MIT. But reflect for a moment that that activity has not reduced the carbon emissions of the country whatsoever. All it's done is changed where MIT's contribution has been placed. Not only has it reduced its contribution, but also it is not any reduction, and indeed the projections are that MIT's activities will continue to increase in their CO2 emissions. Now, in my opinion, the most important and absolutely creditable activity of both Julie Newman and of Joe Higgins and his team is this emphasis on providing our community with data and with descriptions, clear descriptions, which allow us to have transparent discussions of the pros and cons of these activities. So I speak here today not in opposition to that particular summit arrangement, but rather to draw your attention to something which MIT does better perhaps than any other university, and that is to provide transparent data and metrics on which a completely frank and useful conversation should go forward at a university. So I salute that attention to data and metrics in our discussion of climate issues. My final point, and it's one I want to speak about very sternly, that is, it is often said that we should think globally and act locally. I believe that that is entirely wrong. And it's wrong for our students, and it's wrong to speak that way to our students. Our students are capable, and they're dedicated, and they're ambitious. And we should speak to them in terms of thinking globally about climate and acting as much as they can globally. Not to spend their time worrying about what MIT is doing, which is a single, excellent university in a globe filled with many other universities and many other important entities. Their effort should not be to argue for divestment or to harass the trustees of MIT about their investments, or even worse, overburdened president. Their activities should be to get the facts and their analysis together and talk about them in a way which will be as influential in the broader context of the national agenda or even internationally. That doesn't mean they'll have success overnight. But the fact of the matter is, we must have an understanding that it's a global problem, and the responsibility and possibilities for our students and our faculty is to speak out not with a single voice for the institution, but based on facts with measures that should be considered by our leaders and our governments. Very important for the future. Think globally and act globally. Perhaps the most gratifying matter which has happened as a result of this attention and this particular symposium is we at MIT have learned that in order to be successful, in order to change the world for the better, you must integrate the considerations of technology, of social science, and as Melissa so properly said, the ethics and the culture of the community. A very important achievement of MIT. And I might say to you, Paula, when I entered your department of chemical engineering, our attitudes were not that careful about the entire civilization in the country. I'm glad you have brought us to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And I think we're ready to open for questions. And we're going to start with the question, how can universities generate opportunities for greater impact within public policy and implementation of technologies? So I'll pass that to each of you. Maybe we'll start with Melissa first and then John.
Sure. You know, one of the things I so appreciated John's remarks and our agreement that all of the knowledge has to be well integrated to deal with something as complex as climate change. And it seems to me MIT students in particular, but also faculty, but I'll focus on students, are particularly well placed with their training to know the science, know the technology, but also if they take classes in economics and political science and ethics, will be well positioned to work in Washington in these places because they'll have all of the knowledge that they need. You know, I haven't had the experience as John's had of actually working in Washington, but just my observations of looking at certain of the congressional staff, I would imagine that these staff increasingly, what senators and congressmen and our elected leaders need are quite informed staff persons, and they're not easy to come by. I think MIT students in particular are especially well positioned if we continue to educate them and continue to do even more than what we're doing in integrating all of these bodies of knowledge. It's not easy, and it's actually quite demanding. I mean, I mentioned a few classes and such, but students typically want to take deep dives, which this requires. And I think we have to encourage that very deeply. And I'm really glad to hear that John in his remarks called out the need to be quite intentional in how we think about this, that it can't be a side project looking at these things. It has to be an important part of it.
Paula, I'm going to ask you to repeat your question for me, please.
Absolutely. How can universities generate opportunities for greater impact within public policy and implementation of technologies?
Well, the single most important way is the conventional way. They do their studies. They base them, as we've said, on observation, fact, and new knowledge. They publish that and make it as available to everybody in the whole community, from the senators to their Senate staff, to the newspapers, to interested non-governmental organizations. And that knowledge has an influence. And that's the most important job that universities can do. And secondly, individuals, if they're motivated and if they have some experience, can enter that process themselves, either as advisors or as members of a agency in the federal government, starting, I would say, initially on the technical side of the agency, and through their hard work and their good judgment, they will go forward and become influential, and eventually, like our colleague Ernie Moniz, lead such an agency. That seems to me has two benefits. It benefits the world by knowing that people who are technically qualified and have a broad view are basically important decision makers, and excludes people who are not trained and don't have any technical knowledge from making decisions for which they are not prepared. And that is something which is a bipartisan error frequently made. You can put any person to be a leader of an agency, but if that person does not have adequate connection with technology and the opportunities and the risks of technology, that agency is likely to trip. And I have been in that circumstance myself.
Thank you, John. The next question: what more can MIT and other research universities do to speak up for science at a time when some world leaders are devaluing and disparaging it? So we'll start with John on this one and then move to Melissa.
One has to be careful here, Paula. When university leaders speak out on science, they oftentimes are keeping in the back of their minds, and we need to have more money for the science that we do at universities. So the trick here is to point out to the trick here is to point out the opportunities for science, but not to say that this is something which is important for me and therefore I need more money. We want to make a distinction, as my original boss at the Department of Energy said, there's a difference between coming from Princeton University and coming from a milk farmers collaborative in Wisconsin. We're not arguing for special interests. So the most important thing is to present science and the opportunities and importance of science in a way that does not suggest more money.
I agree with all that.
I'm speaking too much. You can cut me off, but I want to tell you, when I was with President Clinton and Vice President Gore, and I would hear their Science Advisory Committee talk about the opportunities for science, their eyes glazed. They came from Tennessee and Arkansas. They didn't come from Massachusetts and California.
Melissa, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't have the. I agree with much of what John said. I have nothing to add to that.
Excellent. The next question is one I'm going to have you start, Melissa, which is, isn't climate change fundamentally a political problem that requires political solutions?
I don't know if it's fundamentally a political problem, but it certainly has deep political dimensions, and we see it in so many ways. One is the different ways in which Americans, for example, I'm going to think about the United States for a moment. Our citizens view climate change. There is some a degree of denialism. There are others who recognize its existence, but are concerned about what it would cost to correct for it. So it is quite political in certain ways. It is an issue, along with so many others, about which our politics are fraught, right? So at bottom, politics is about adjudicating different kinds of interest and trade-offs and desires. I mean, there are lots of things that we want, and they are not all, and we can't all have them in equal measure. And it requires that we have some, I don't know if we can reach a consensus, but some adjudication. And that's a political process, which is true, which is quite aside from climate change. Any number of issues are subject to that same dynamic. But I wouldn't say that it's only political, but I would say that you certainly can't address climate change without taking politics into account. Let me just give an example. Many European, the issue of whether climate change is real is not a real political issue in most European countries. It is an enormously political issue here in the United States.
Paul, I can be very brief here. First of all, I completely agree with what Melissa has said. Secondly, I would say to you that all problems, no matter what they are basically political problems. That is because their resolution requires some winners and some losers. So understanding politics with a small p is an important part of every problem that we face.
Thank you. The next question is how do financially strapped public research universities address sustainability and resilience compared to better funded private universities? Now let either one of you take a stab.
Is it true what you say?
The financially strapped public research universities, how do they address sustainability and resilience if they have financial constraints?
But we all have financial constraints. Are you suggesting that theirs are worse than the private universities?
Yeah, I think that's what the question is asking. It presumes that, I think, John.
Well, I'm sorry. Let's take the cream off the private universities.
Okay.
Take away, Princeton and MIT and what's the name of the school up the river there? Take those away.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's true for the whole. In fact, I'm quite sure it isn't true for the entire community of private universities generally throughout the country. Are we only talking about elitist private schools? So Paul, I don't be. No, I don't think the public universities deserve any more special attention than all universities.
All right. Excellent. Another question is how can universities learn to communicate climate change issues and solutions in a way that average educated people can understand?
Well, that's certainly an important issue. That is, how do we communicate any number of complex issues to citizenry, which needs to understand these issues in order to make judgments, all kinds of judgments about what's going on in their own communities to what's going on in their states and countries and such. And it's a challenge, but it's one that we must face. But I often wonder, and here I'm just speculating, if it's only a communication. That is, we sometimes hope if we just give people the facts, they'll see it the way we want them to see it, in presuming whatever side of any issue one is on. And we can see that people integrate and think about taking information differently and process it differently. So that isn't to say that I don't agree that we need clearer and more communication about issues, about climate change, for example. I think journalists, you're beginning to see the increases in science journalism, although I must say that the hits that we're seeing in the United States in particular, I'm going to speak about the United States, the issues of journalism, the decline of newspapers and the like, the professional hits that journalism has taken as a profession, and they would be oftentimes science journalists are very capable communicators often of these complex issues, but we're seeing a decrease in science journalism, which is to our detriment. So there are a role, obviously, of universities. I mean, a certain of our faculty, for example, can write newspaper articles, can write op-eds, those kinds of things, or contribute to, not write newspaper articles, but contribute to journalists. And they can also write op-eds and such. And I also think we should think about fortifying as individuals the importance of a free and vibrant press. The fourth estate needs help in our country, I think.
Paula, I think you're going to feel a little bit more relaxed about this question in a couple of weeks here about how we explain it. And I do think that, in fact, the American people, at least this way I understand these polls, these opinion polls, are very much understanding the questions, the risks of climate change. I think a more difficult question, Paula, is how do you explain it to the people in India or in China or in Mexico or in South Africa who don't have the resources we do to deal with it? That, I think, is a much greater challenge than the United States, where I believe that we are making progress and that indeed next week we'll be in a lot better shape.
Thank you both. Very thoughtful answers. Another question is, what can MIT and the world's other great research universities do together in a collaborative effort to address the climate crisis? Let either one of you take it.
Again, I would say that I would be cautious about that. You don't want to have a group of universities saying this is the priority issue in contrast to the other priority issues that we face, whether it's pandemics, health in general, poverty, race, democracy. I don't know that coming together as a group of universities isn't indeed an unwise step. I would not support it.
I think that tying to that and perhaps refining it a bit, I think we already see our individual faculty collaborating. So it may not well be institutional in the way that John is cautioning us, but it seems as if on tons of research, both technological and scientific, social scientific, we've had faculty. That's kind of the nature of research now. Tons of collaboration across along particular research lines, if not strong institutional lines as such. And I think that's pretty robust, and I can't imagine that's going to change. And it seems to be very much in keeping with the caution that John has told us about kind of institutional directions, but still reflects the kind of innovative ways in which faculty work together along issues of common interest.
Melissa, I wish I had been clever enough to think about that way of presenting the issue. Much, much, much more effective than what I said.
No worries.
Excellent. All right. This will be the last question.
Okay.
What are the ethical implications of the role of technology and innovation that MIT students and faculty must consider as we seek to solve for climate change?
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
No.
I certainly one we have to think about is that we all worry about, and which is we can't always know the full impacts of what it is that we're going to create, right? So social media is much in the news today, as we all know, and it may have started out with a very noble beginnings, right? Just to bring people together using a particular digital platform, and we can create community. But we've noticed that we now know our experiences that it's much more complicated than that. Now, whether that could have been foreseen as that technology was beginning, was there something in the inception process that wasn't well considered? Who knows? But I think we all suspect that we need to think a bit more deeply, kind of act and think much more deeply from the beginning, and to consider who the audiences are, who are we creating this for, what are the possible impacts, both positive and negative. So yeah, there are deep implications, but then also after technology is created, we may have to figure out ways to mitigate its impacts if they aren't good. But I suppose the notion that any technology is by definition good, or that it doesn't require critical thinking from the very start, seems to me we can all agree we can no longer go that way. I think our fellow humans are expecting that we think much more deeply about it. And I think we here at MIT have an obligation to prepare our students with the tools that they will need, that certainly come up when we're thinking about computing. And I don't see why it should be limited to just that.
Excellent.
I certainly agree that there are an enormous number of ethical dilemmas here. And I will just stand behind what Melissa said. There are ethical dilemmas, and our students should be aware of them.
Thank you. Thank you both for that excellent discussion.